Every leader has a strategy. Executing on that strategy is the challenge. If you want to learn how to effectively achieve what you've set out to accomplish, then this show is for you. Gain keen insights and listen in as leaders share their stories and challenges. SOAR Vision Group and the Baldrige Foundation welcome you to Leader Dialogue Radio.
Hello, everyone. I'm Duffie Dixon. Welcome to Leader Dialogue, brought to you by SOAR Vision Group and the Baldrige Foundation. Joining me, we have a full house. Ben Sawyer, who is the Chief Executive Officer of SOAR Vision Group, Jennifer Strahan, who's the Chief Operating Officer, and Lisa Council, who is the Chief Commercial Officer. Our special guest today, as we had last week, it is Georgia's Lieutenant Governor, Geoff Duncan. Thank you so much for joining us, Geoff.
Thanks for inviting me back.
Now, for those of you who don't know, you may know he's the Lieutenant Governor, but here's a little more background of him. He's a former professional baseball player and successful entrepreneur. He was elected as the Lieutenant Governor in November of 2018. Geoff's faith inspired him to a life of leadership and prompted him to start his political run. Well, he was elected to the Georgia House of Representatives in 2012, and during his time in office, he's proud of several pieces of legislation. These are the biggies: HB 749, which is the Cargo Theft Act, HB 152, known as Michael's Law, and most recently, SB 258, the Rural Hospital Tax Credit. And with that last bill, I think we're going to start off talking about rural health. This is something that we have tackled on this show several times. It is a biggie.
Yes, and so just to tee this up, we have planned a leadership roundtable event for rural health leaders in Birmingham, Alabama on November 6th and 7th. We're excited about that. There are 16 right now CEOs coming in. We're doing this in collaboration with the University of Alabama Professional Health Services program. And so, Geoff, I know you have a lot of background in rural health, and this is a big interest within Georgia. Can you just kind of kick this off from the standpoint of your perspective on rural health and what some of the limitations and opportunities are there?
Yeah, it's a challenge, right? And it's not just Georgia. Rural health care is an issue in all parts of our country. And it was a challenge that I was new to when I showed up in the legislature in 2013 as a House member, because I was always from a suburban area, right?
Yeah.
And access to health care, and you never ran the risk of your hospital going out of business,
right,
or not having the correct specialist within 100 miles of where you're at.
Right.
And so when I walked in, I just continued to hear over and over and over again, and I kept watching subsidies and grants and things fly out the door, but we weren't solving the problem. And that's when I wrote the Rural Health Care Tax Credit Bill that essentially identified 54 rural hospitals by their local population and some other metrics, and said, look, we're going to allow the community to invest in themselves. And we gave a tax credit at 100% of what was given to corporations and citizens to write checks directly to those rural hospitals.
Wow.
Long story short, $60 million a year now flows into 54 rural hospitals in rural Georgia without any sort of budget growth, without any sort of oversight.
That's
because
amazing.
Yeah, and here's the problem, because when government gives money, they also tie strings to it.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so these rural hospitals were like, well, gosh, every time I accept a grant, I got to go buy a new piece of equipment and go see a new type of patient, and it doesn't really make it as effective as I need it to be.
So what has been the impact in terms of closures or whatever other metric that you're using?
So I don't believe any of the hospitals that were covered in the 54 have closed.
Nice.
I think it's been 4 or 5 years since the program launched. I might miss that by once. I don't want to oversell the program, but I don't think any were. As I campaigned to be lieutenant governor, I literally traveled all over the state and for years. And to have administrators, nurses, technicians meet me kind of on on parade routes and come up, tears in their eyes, give me a hug, saying you saved our hospital, which wasn't me, it was the legislature that did it. The stories are they were able to go buy new equipment or create new surgical procedures that created new revenue streams that allowed them to produce even more money than just the tax credit. And so that's really the system here.
Yeah.
Communities have to invest in themselves, both education and healthcare, or any other challenges, criminal justice. If a community doesn't believe in themselves and have that vision, then there's no level of subsidy that's going to fix it.
And they're the closest to it, so they're the ones that have the best knowledge.
And they're the ones that have...
They're vested.
That's
they have
exactly
the
right.
most vested interest.
They have the most vested interest in a positive outcome.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, Jennifer, you're finishing your doctorate at UAB, and this rural health thing has been kind of a particular interest of you. Can you just sort of explain to the listening audience what that's about?
Well, one thing that comes to mind for me is if you guys recall when we had Bob Peterson on the show, he's the CEO of a critical access hospital in Maine. And you're right, it's not just Georgia, it's everywhere. One of the things that stood out to me, and I can't remember the exact number he said, but it was something around 70% or so of the U.S. are actually rural based. So we talk in the cities and the urban areas get the most of our attention, but the reality is the service of most people here really does depend on those services in rural America. And so when you talk about it, it goes back to some of the things we talked about last week, right? It hits access. How do we make sure people are getting the right access to the care they need? No more, no less, right? We also know there's other issues within healthcare in terms of just making sure it's safe so that we maintain high quality and high reliability for our organizations, and that it's affordable. So affordability really impacts access just as much as an actual opening to go to an appointment, right? If I can't afford my medication or I can't afford transportation to get there, then I'm not going to go. I don't have the opportunity, or at least the perceived opportunity to go. So what comes to mind for me is how do we make this system easier to navigate by understanding the stakeholders, what they need, and how do we take down the barriers so that we can achieve that end result for them?
So, Geoff, in terms of your experience with rural health in Georgia, talk to us a little bit about what you guys had identified in terms of access and affordability. And I'm thinking of things like access to physicians, because in a rural area, they may not be incentivized.
Well, it includes technology. So telemedicine, telehealth would be a good example from a technology perspective for health.
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. But I think we have to understand it's a multifaceted approach, right?
Right.
And so telehealth is a component. Part of the 22 healthcare bills that we passed this year in the General Assembly, which was the year before the General Assembly had passed one. So, I mean, we made healthcare a priority.
Wow.
That's pretty good growth. But a lot of that was wrapped around telehealth and trying to modernize our definition of telehealth and being able to use that as a potential service or solution in certain factions. But, you got ideas like direct primary care. And I mean, you have to it's a different business model in the rural areas. And but there's also a mindset, right? We don't want anybody to just use healthcare when something hurts. We need them to be able to identify and use it as primary care and be able to know that you're a farmer, you get cut on a rusty blade and you go get treatment for $50, everybody gets out with 3 stitches and an antibiotic, as opposed to waiting 2 months, 3 months, and it turns into an infection and amputation. We all understand what that looks like.
Right.
So weaving in the importance of healthcare to all parts of Georgia, I think, is really the challenge ahead, but we're continuing to see progress. But I got to be honest with you, it's also the education system, it's the economic development structure around that. If there isn't insurance to be had, or there isn't the service, or there isn't the best and brightest wanting to stay there. I mean, it's a big ecosystem.
Yeah, so let's unpack that ecosystem just a little bit. You talked about education. We talked about education last week as well. What is unique in terms of the rural environment in terms of education and access?
So one of the things, I think a great starting point to understand education in rural Georgia is typically it is either the largest or one of the largest employers in that county or in that area. And so understanding the importance of what that education system is from just a survival.
Right.
And look, we want local, I don't want anybody telling, my 3 kids are in public schools in Forsyth County. I don't want somebody from another county coming in and tell us how to run our schools. And I'm certain there's other counties that don't want us. But we also have to make sure, because of the amount of dollars being spent, and also this is the vision I try to cast on these rural communities, you're important to our future here in Georgia.
Right.
If we're going to execute on all cylinders and achieve this game plan of being the best and brightest in this country, then we're going to need you.
Right.
And so to that point, what can we do to help you center that education system around the child, not around the system?
Right.
It's hard.
Yeah.
It's challenging. It looks different in different places. Got it. But it doesn't mean it's not worthy of the challenge to go try to tackle it. I think we're doing a good job. One of the best things, I'm going to applaud our governor for here. He's a great friend of mine, but Governor Kemp talked about on the campaign trail giving teachers a pay raise. And it was a huge deal. And it was one of the first meetings I sat in with him after we won the election. He won as governor. I won as lieutenant governor. He said, let's go figure out how to do this. And $3,000 to every teacher in the state of Georgia was a huge deal to make a down payment on some of the most important boots on the ground to our future.
Yeah. No, that's
awesome.
a great point.
One of the things that comes to mind as you talk about that is it's often very difficult for people to see the connection between the long-term vision and the immediate need that I have right in front of me. And because those things, it's one of those, what is it, the analogy, you can't see the forest through the trees. It's, I see what's right here. I see the urgency of what's in front of me. But what you mentioned around building our future, I mean, our babies, that's our future. That's the, the process that we're trying to develop as they grow to have successful communities.
And think about the longevity of, I don't know, I'm trying to think of the industry like a railroad, right? I mean, a railroad might be planning 30, 40 years from now with the infrastructure and investments they're making today. I mean, we might even have to think about education in even longer terms than just our kids, right? It potentially could be our kids' kids that really benefit from strategy. I mean, think about this. We are as modern as we are. We're all receiving content on our devices left and right. I mean, I can tell you what the stock market's doing in any country in 5 clicks or less. I can get any useless fact in 30 seconds or less. My kids are great at doing that. But here we are taking end of the year tests, standardized tests. So think about this. My policy director, Mike Dudgeon, calls this the educational autopsy. We wait to the end of the year, we give them a test, we wait to the end of the summer, and literally last week I just got my son's milestone results from the 7th grade, and he's already well into his 8th grade year. We need to be able to deploy technology to give flexibility and create a nimble environment for our educators to be able to understand if a kid's above grade or below grade. Because those educators, quite honestly, I mean, who gets into education to be a billionaire? You get into education to deploy a gift you've got. I think that's a big part of this system. I think if a lot of those teachers in both rural and suburban areas felt that ability to maneuver, they would be much more successful.
It would help them if they could know halfway through the year where their kids stand, because that way they can get those kids caught up before, like you said, they're in the next grade.
And quite honestly,
it only gets harder as you get higher up.
Quite honestly, I think they sense that those kids are above or below grade, but they're not given the flexibility to be able to navigate, on maybe a parallel path or an alternate path to be able to help that kid get through whatever they get through. I mean, I've got 3 kids. One's good at math, one's good at being funny, and one's good at math or at science. It's just every kid's different.
Yeah, so it's interesting. This challenge of really understanding what's going on in terms of real-time data is true across any organization. We run into it in healthcare all the time, which is known for its what we refer to as retrospective data. So the analogy,
even though they've spent hundreds of millions of dollars on EMRs,
that's right,
and they still can't get the data we need.
So the simple analogy we give is the reason when you're driving your car, you have a speedometer in front of you is you need it now to understand where you're at. If you got an email when you got home of how fast you were going, it's not relevant anymore.
Funny that you use that analogy, because we have an app now with a 17-year-old driver that I get that email when he puts it in park and gets out. We get to have a couple of conversations about top speed and acceleration.
So it is valuable to a parent.
You're absolutely right. It's about the proper size dashboard in front of you, and the correct. I don't really care about my RPMs. I don't really care about my oil cycle life. I care about my speed. I care about my direction.
Right.
And teachers and educators do too. I mean, look, everybody's got their heart in the right place around education, in my opinion. I mean, it's about understanding the tools and the resources it's going to take to accomplish those goals.
Right.
I mean, we talk about the metric everybody talks about is the 3rd grade reading levels, right?
Yep.
We get there. It is just as painfully obvious as to how important that is. I mean, you can build great scenarios. You can build awful scenarios based on that single metric alone.
Right.
And how are we impactful to that? Because think about the quality of life after that.
Right. So what are some of the corollary statistics in Georgia relative to the 3rd grade reading? We talked a little bit about this off show in terms of prison beds and homelessness and social challenges because kids drop out early and things like that. Are there any sort of prevailing challenges within Georgia relative to 3rd grade reading proficiency?
I think almost every government subsidized program somehow, some way could probably have a direct correlation to that 3rd grade reading level. I mean, I don't know.
It's that big.
I mean, I'm just making a generic statement. Healthcare outcomes, correction, the correction system, all of those. And so the importance of getting in there. But look, we have to remember that we can hustle as hard as we possibly can from an education system, from a funding system. But the outcomes will be exponentially better if parents and guardians get dialed in.
That's right.
Right? And that's really my launch into politics was sitting in a church getting challenged to not be one of those people that complains, but actually gets involved and does something. And one of those examples that they used was education, right? Everybody's complaining about teachers and curriculum and school systems and all that. But how many parents are spending at least, 5 or 10 minutes every night at the kitchen table with their own kid?
That's right.
And that narrative needs to not just be a talking point. It needs to be a reality. If you just spend a couple of minutes with your kid coming home, and look, different scenarios. There's single parent homes, there's dual parent homes, there's guardians, there's foster families, adopted. There's all kinds of scenarios. But if we just spent a couple of minutes every night saying, hey, what'd you learn today? What are y'all talking about today? Did you have any projects due? And when's your next test? Hey, what do you want to be when you still want to be an engineer? Yeah, that's great. Everything you're learning in math is going to help you on that. All right, go take a shower. Gotta go. Like just that conversation alone drives home and does something that billions and billions of dollars can't do.
Yeah, that's exactly
and I don't have
right.
a law I can create to achieve personal responsibility. It's a mentality. I want Georgia to be better at that than anybody. Ultimately, I want the country to be great at it. But in Georgia, I want to drive that narrative home and be able to point back to that and say, you know what, we're doing this.
Well, providing information back to the parents and or guardians is key, Geoff, that you mentioned. Seriously, if they can actually see where their child is, either in a particular subject or in their total GPA, and then be able to really bring back those questions at home, again, that data is relevant to getting engagement from those parents.
Or if you could just do a how-to parenting book, that'd be great too. Maybe.
I think his wife has
I've got a few more years before I'm going to be prepared to write that.
But I
want
do
to make sure they turn out okay.
I got to get my 9-year-old off. He's, by the way, my 9-year-old's the funny one in the crowd. That's what he's really good at.
Yeah, he is.
So time will pass, and you'll be writing that book. But what's interesting as I'm listening to this is this can be an important part of the public discourse, right? This is what's important, and the challenge, like when I turn on the TV, I'm not hearing a lot of this kind of stuff. Instead, I'm hearing about all the bad stuff that happened and all the sort of frustrating things. It would be interesting if there was commitment within public discourse to say, let's just talk about some things that really matter. Here's some things that have happened in the foster care arena as an example of where people stepped out and provided homes for these kids that don't have parents, and look at the significant impact on them, or adoption and the power of adoption, or just like you said, Geoff, spending time with your kids every day to see where they're at and how to help them.
Yeah, I wrote an op-ed years ago, and I'm not an author or no English teacher would have said I would have written anything that got published. But I wrote this op-ed that was just burning in my belly called The 4 C's. It was called Churches, Charities, Corporations, and Citizens. Yeah. And it really was just a focus that said, look, if the 4 C's get to deploy themselves around issues and challenges around poverty, they bring things that government programs can never bring, right? They bring volunteerism, which is still free to this day. They bring innovation, but probably most importantly, they bring exit strategy. If we think about government programs too often, they're just really, on their best day, they're there to stabilize. They're not there to change trajectory. And that's not a knock against them. But the 4 C's really show up. I mean, think about it. If a company really just gets fired up and gets 1,000 employees to really pull together to help build homes or mentor kids or feed the hungry or foster programs that get kicked off, or a church digs in. I know, Lisa and I go to a church that just does a tremendous amount of work every year in just deploying dollars and volunteerism into these community programs that are doing great work. And not trying to get the credit for it, right? Ronald Reagan's quote, I've heard it a million ways. I'm going to give Ronald Reagan credit for it. If you don't care who gets credit, right, it's amazing what you can get done. And that's one of these mentalities. I think the 4 C's are an avenue for us to just be exponentially better at helping those in need.
One of the things I would just mention, too, I think this is interesting as we talk about all of these problems, whether it's rural health, whether it's talking about consumerism, whether it's coming into education, it's no small feat, right? These are big things. And I think one area where we struggle is being able to break down these really big concepts into very tangible actions, right? So the struggle on parenting, if you just come home and talk to your kids, right? Read them a book, one book, just read them a book every day. That alone has, I think I've been told, the most significant impact on childhood literacy. I read somewhere that if you talk to your kids the most important times you talk are the first 3 minutes they wake up, the first 3 minutes they get home from school, and the first 3 minutes or last 3 minutes before bed. And so if you just find those little bitty tangible things that can drive improvement, you're not moving mountains, but collectively, when everyone starts to do these, or you start to add that into other improvements, it starts to actually move as opposed to just
That's
stabilize.
right. Yesterday I had an opportunity to give a speech or a conversation with all the freshman legislators that were in. So the Speaker of the House and myself, and one of the reps asked, what's the best advice that you can give? And I was like, oh gosh, make a lot of relationships, make friends on both sides of the aisle, kind of thing. And then then it hit me. I was like, don't think government's a solution for everything.
Right.
Don't wake up every day. And it's, look, when you're inside the bubble, it's easy to think that, it's like any business, it's transactional. You feel value in the number of transactions that so don't think government's the solution to everything, right? Because it isn't.
Right.
Even on its best day.
Right. And Jennifer, to your point, there are key levers. And it's understanding what the problems actually are, and then what are the key levers that if you pull on those, you have the greatest impact. And what you just described in terms of the intersection of 3 minutes with your child throughout the day, that's a perfect example of a key lever.
So this year we had a bill that we passed, I think it was SB 108. My policy director came to me, and he's a big technology guy. He's had a couple of really good exits. And he said, you know that only 0.5% of high school kids are graduating from Georgia with one computer science class. Just one.
Oh, my heavens.
I mean, Fred Flintstone took a computer science class, right?
And especially considering your kids know how to work the computer better and the iPhone better than you do.
And there's a number of reasons why that's the case. I mean, some districts didn't have the funding to set it up. Some districts, it just wasn't important. It's a heavily ag industry. But, whatever the reason is. So we passed a bill that basically says every kid has to take at least one computer science class. And then we got the state budget, and we were able to fund the schools so that they could have a teacher or do an online curriculum course or whatnot. But the point was to expose these kids to technology. Right? Technology knows no boundaries. It might end up being the greatest tool to help us in rural Georgia and the issues around poverty because it knows no boundaries.
Right.
Exactly.
And how we deliver that and how we instill in those kids fundamental issues like that maybe cost the state $1 million, as opposed to, how many kids are going to bite into technology, realize that their synapses are firing, they want to go excel in their high school, education, go graduate from high school, go get a technical school, or go to a workforce development program, and go make $60,000 or $70,000 a year for the rest of their life or more.
Right. And actually, I want to applaud Georgia that we're really pro technical school, and we have lots of gap opportunities for education, because a 4-year education is not for every child. So again, Georgia has come along really strong in that area. So
just because they have a good football team doesn't mean you ought to go spend $100,000.
Exactly, for sure.
So Geoff, it has been an absolute pleasure having you on the Leader Dialogue Radio Show these 2 weeks. Thanks for sticking around.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for what you're doing, and great to be here. And I'd love to come back another time.
That sounds great.
And you notice he just started the job because there is no gray in his hair. We'll be with him.
You're not looking close enough.
We'll be with you after 1 term, 2 terms. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us, and thanks for your insight, and thanks for the work you're doing on behalf of Georgia.
Thank you.
And thank you to everyone else for listening to Leader Dialogue, brought to you by SOAR Vision Group and the Baldrige Foundation. Remember, you can listen to a new live show every Friday at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. Visit businessradiox.com, click on the Gwinnett Studio, select our show, Leader Dialogue. Or you can also listen to this or any other of our podcasts by doing leaderdialogue.com/podcast. On behalf of Ben, Jennifer, Lisa, and myself, thanks for joining us on Leader Dialogue right here on Business Radio X.